So it is Thursday evening in Iceland. I had two games today. I just finished my round three game, but I'm going to go ahead and do my round two recap from this morning. I played Grandmaster Adhiban Baskaran from India. He's a pretty well known player, and I imagine a lot of viewers would recognize his name. He's been featured in a few of my videos. Most prominently, we played this kind of banter trash talk game in the Stafford Gambit back in July in Sochi. So I'll link that below if you guys want to see a more casual type game. But here we played a serious classical game, and it was my first time playing Adhiban in a graded OTB game. And he played e4, and I had a little bit of time to prepare last night. The pairings went up sometime around like 9 or 10 or 11 p.m. Already forgetting, but it was a 9 a.m. round this morning, so I didn't prepare too much just because I wanted to get enough sleep. And I decided to play the Sicilian. And Adhiban recently came out with a lifetime repertoire course in 1e4 for white. And in that course, he recommends knight f3, and that was the main thing I was preparing for him. But in the game, he surprised me with a move pawn c3, going for an Alapin Sicilian. And after the game, I jokingly told him that I thought he mouse slipped pawn b3 because he's known for playing this move as well, the so-called cowboy system or whatever this is. But pawn c3, it's not a move that I have studied so recently, but I do have experience in this line as a Sicilian player. Now, I also want to mention that after the game, he was telling me that it would have been funny if I had played the Stafford, but I told him it would be a bit too predictable. So the game continued from here. I played pawn d5. This is one of the main lines. Alternative is knight f6. But the point of pawn d5 is after takes and takes. Because white has committed the pawn to c3, there's no knight c3. So this is one of the most reputable lines for black. And after d4, knight f6, knight f3, this is all opening preparation. Knight a3 was played. Knight a3 is a tricky move. If I'm not mistaken, I think there is some like hand in brain between Ludwig and Magnus against the Botez sisters. I'm pretty sure they had this exact position. I'll have to check it though.
I'm gonna get nuts. Love it. That's what I wanted you to do. They
A
say
knight
a knight
on
on the
the
rim is
rim?
grim.
But this is kind of mainline theory, and white has ideas of knight b5, and if black's not careful, then it can be easy to get into trouble. But thankfully, I was still pretty prepared here. Played knight c6, and the point is, if knight b5 right away, I can very simply move back to d8, and if bishop f4 threatening knight c7, then I have the nice move knight d5, hitting the bishop and defending c7. So instead of going for this line, Adhiban played bishop to e3, which I think is a more testing move for white to try and get the advantage. And now white has ideas of taking and trying to win a pawn because that would open up the file for the queen trade. And here I take and knight b5. And I think this is still some opening preparation on my part, but it's been years since I looked at this line. So at some point, I was just on my own after queen d8, takes, and yeah, bishop takes d4. I had some vague memories of knight takes d4, but bishop takes d4 was a new move for me. And here I started thinking, because there are a few different options for black. Now, the most obvious move, and I'm checking the database here, the most played move too is bishop to e7, which maybe I should have played. But I didn't play bishop e7 because after bishop to d3, white has ideas of knight e5, and I thought it would be a little bit passive for black because it's hard to develop this bishop so actively. Like if I play b6 here, I'm pretty sure knight e5, and I have to worry about queen f3 and bishop e5 check and knight c6. So I was already sensing a little bit of danger. And instead of going for bishop e7, I went for a more perhaps active move, queen d5. And the point of this was to, in some sense, stay flexible, because I wasn't sure where my bishop wants to develop to, whether it goes to e7, d6, or c5. And I'm also pinning the knight, in some sense, to the g2 pawn, because after the bishop develops, the knight would be pinned to g2. And I wasn't scared of this line because I could throw in queen takes d1, and yeah, even though I have double pawns, black is probably for choice with the bishop pair. So here Adhiban played queen b3, which I think is a very sensible move, going for a queen trade. And I don't want to take because that would just strengthen white's position and open a file. So I deliver a check on e4, and after bishop e2, now I play bishop d7, and I'm getting ready to castle. And up until this point, I was feeling pretty good, especially because the queen is essentially tying down the king to defending the bishop. White can't castle either way, which would just leave the bishop hanging. And I thought it's up to white to solve some of the issues here. And Adhiban played a move which I think I saw, but I just completely underestimated. And I think it turned out to be a really strong move here, is knight to d2. Basically showing me that the knight wasn't fully pinned to the g2 pawn. And this is a very temporary pawn sacrifice, but it does lead to a trade of pawns after I take on g2. White wins back the pawn after bishop f3, move my queen, after takes, takes, takes. This was all relatively forcing from knight d2, and now my rook is hit, and I can't castle. I would love to castle, but now my king is the one tied down to the bishop. So there's basically only one move here for black to try and keep things defended, which is queen to d5. And I should note my queen has just moved a lot of times in the opening. I have defied some basic principles. My queen has moved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the first 16 moves. But okay, queen d5 is very much justified here. And Adhiban went ahead and took. And here it looks like my next move should be played pretty quickly, but I ended up taking a long think in this position, trying to decide whether to take with the pawn or the knight. And unfortunately, it's a really difficult decision because black is already a little bit worse here. And I will admit, I haven't checked this game so closely with the engine, so I don't know entirely where I went wrong leading up to this point. But this was a really uncomfortable decision to make because if I take with pawn, then this pawn on d5 is just going to be a long-term weakness. White has rook g1, probably forcing g6, and then after queenside castling, yeah, this d5 pawn, at the right moment, white's probably going to plan to take on f6, maybe first play knight f3, and then go after d5. And I thought I would be very likely to lose a pawn eventually in this variation. So I ultimately decided to lose a pawn right away by taking with a knight on d5. And yeah, even though I lose a g7 pawn here, I thought there are some chances to get initiative and some counterplay, because white does have to spend some time moving the bishop. So yeah, he very quickly snagged the pawn on g7. I played rook g8, and then he played a very nice move. Rather than just retreating all the way back to d4, he played bishop to e5, which is a very useful square for the bishop because it prevents me from accessing the b file, my queenside rook, and it also has some tricks, like if I go in too deep with rook g2, then there's bishop g3, and my rook is getting trapped next move due to king f1. I should also note bishop e5 is prophylaxis against knight f4, which is a move I really wanted to play to get some quadruple fork potential. But yeah, my knight is very much restricted in this position. So I went ahead and played pawn f6, made the bishop move another time. And here I wanted to play pawn f5 to trap the bishop, but unfortunately white can just return to e5. And only thing accomplished here is the fact that I've weakened the e5 square. So rather than going for that, I just improved my queenside rook to c8, And I still felt like I have some sort of compensation, but it was really hard to prove in the game. And this is one of the downsides of just being down a pawn is it's basically up to me to try and create counterplay. And from White's perspective, he just wanted to stay solid and eventually simplify. Game continued from here, queenside castling. I played rook to g4, trying to create some ideas of swinging the rook all the way over to a4. Also had ideas of h5, h4 to still try and trap the bishop. So I was trying to stay flexible, but he played a very natural move, rook to e1, hitting the pawn, and also having the idea after king f7 is to play rook e4, just neutralizing my rook. And yeah, I realized that rook g4 didn't accomplish so much. And now I either have to trade immediately or defend my rook. I thought about trading for a bit because after takes, I do have the move pawn f5, threatening the knight, and also threatening to trap the bishop. But unfortunately here there's knight d6, and this is just forcing trades, and white's still up a pretty clean pawn. So I decided to play pawn h5, trying to keep some tension. Now f3 was played. After takes, I went into e3 with the knight, attacking the rook. He played rook to e1, and I defend the knight with bishop c5. So yeah, I'm still down a pawn, but I still felt hopeful that the activity between the bishop and the knight would create some compensation. But he played a really solid move here, rook to e2, just solidifying the whole territory for white. And it's actually hard to find a plan for black in this position. I decided to play pawn a5 with some idea of eventually pushing all the way to a3 to undermine the queenside structure. And here bishop f2 was played. And I was actually hoping that he would play bishop f2 during the game because I have a cool move, knight g2, with a point that if bishop takes bishop, it looks like white's just winning a piece, but I have a clever intermezzo knight f4, hitting the rook and repairing knight d3. White's still probably better here after a move like rook e3 or rook f2, but we didn't go into this. After knight g2, we just repeated. He played bishop g3. I moved my knight back to e3, and then instead of repeating a third time, which I would have been really happy with, he played the move knight to b3, which I think is a very effective way of making progress in the position, because now I have a bunch of targets that are under pressure from white's pieces, and I have to be careful not to lose even more material. And the only move I saw to keep everything defended was knight to c4. If I move the bishop back to e6 or a7, then the bishop's no longer defended, and bishop f2 should be winning material for white after a line like this. Takes, and takes. So I did play knight c4, defending the pawn. And after takes, still not a pawn, but unfortunately, this is where white begins making very steady progress, starting with pawn b3, kicking away my knight. Now my knight's restricted. All these squares are pretty much off limits. I didn't want to play knight e5. I thought this is just a losing king rook ending after king d2. And eventually the king's going to walk up. The pawn is going to push. White has ideas of a3, b4. And I didn't see too much hope here. So I went back to b6. And after king c2, it was just really hard to find active moves for black. My knight was severely misplaced, being restricted by the pawn. I tried to reroute it with knight to c8. And my plan here was to play e5 and knight d6 to try and create some weakness on e4. But he played really well here. Starting with c4, I played e5, and now rook d2. And this move prevents knight d6, but it also prepares the move rook d5, which is just really hard to stop. And I ended up allowing it with the move king e6. And after rook d5, I either have to trade rooks or retreat and lose another pawn. I decided to trade, but after takes, we are entering an endgame which is completely winning for white. And the technique from Adhiban was just flawless here. I don't think there were any mistakes on his part in endgame. After bishop e1, this pawn is very weak. I tried to get some counterplay with my king, but after king d3, I'm a little bit boxed out. All these squares are off limits. So I played knight to d6, and after takes, I played f5. And nice move from white, pawn b4, driving my king away from the center. And now after takes, king e4. White's just making clear progress, forking my knight and my pawn with the king. And I played on because sometimes knights can be tricky in these scenarios, but it didn't last long before white was able to convert this for a win. After knight h6, takes knight g4, the king walks up, the pawn walks up, and I was going for one last trick in the position. We got to this position after knight c6, controlling the d8 square, and I was really hoping that white would queen here, after which the position would become a draw due to takes, and takes, and I'll be winning the pawn. Or I could even just run into the corner. This is just a theoretical draw if the king gets to the 8 square because the bishop is of the wrong color. But this didn't happen. Unfortunately for me, Adhiban played pawn a4. Very nice move, making use of another white pawn in the position. And here I just resigned. My king is going to be driven away from the knight. And yeah, this is game over. So I think it was a very clean game on White's part. I'm not sure if Adhiban made any like clear mistakes or inaccuracies this game, and I don't even know where I went wrong this game. It could have been some small moments in the opening, but yeah, I may have just stumbled into like a really uncomfortable line, and I think all it took was a few subtle mistakes for the position to just go downhill. So I did intentionally share this game without any engine analysis because I think it can be a healthy approach to review games without the engine first, and then take a look at the engine later, and then have a better idea of what's going on in the position. So for those that want to analyze this game in more depth, I will leave a link in the description to my Lichess study where I'm saving all my games from this tournament. I'll also leave links to the official tournament website, pairings and standings, the official live broadcast, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Kudos to Adhiban for playing a really nice game. I'll leave Adhiban's chessable courses and his YouTube channel also in the description. You can check him out. And again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.